Welcome if this is your first time here. Welcome back if you've seen any of my other videos. Today I'm going to paint a simple landscape scene. We're going to practice our brushwork, our color mixing, and finding the large shapes in the scene. So let's take a look. Alright, here's a look at the reference photo for today. And it's a fairly simple scene. We have some interesting clouds that we're going to kind of simplify, and we have a kind of a connected shape of trees in the background and a little more interest with a few hay bales that are in the scene. I'm painting on a small sheet of paper today. This is 7.5 by 11 inches, and I thought we'd keep it small today and just really talk about some fundamentals in painting landscapes. So the first thing that we're going to do is a quick drawing. And I know that I want my horizon line to be on the lower third of the scene. So right around here, I like to establish the horizon line first. And right about here, I'm going to move this hay bale over into this third of the scene. And there's a few more distant hay bales, and then there's a tree over on the left side of the painting. And I'll have that tree kind of come up here, maybe scoot it in a little bit, and that's going to kind of frame in our scene on this side. And over here, let's see, so then we want these trees in the background, and those just kind of fade off into the distance. So we'll have our larger hay bale here. Let's kind of put it at an angle, make it a little more interesting. Maybe we'll add in a few more hay bales, maybe one here, and maybe another larger one over here. And here's another interest area in our painting. I'm going to move this tree over slightly and have another hay bale right underneath it. As we think about how we want to paint this, I want to paint my lightest values in my first wash. Then I want to come back and paint most of my middle values, and then I'll go in and add some darks and details at the end of the scene. Okay, so let's talk about what we want to do in the first wash of our painting. You may have seen in some of my other videos that I like to wet down both sides of my paper and lay it flat on my surface as I paint. So if that's something you're not comfortable with, don't feel like you have to paint that way. Basically, I'm wetting down the paper so it's damp longer and it gives me more time to paint wet into wet and get some nice soft edges in the scene. But you can accomplish something very similar if you like to tape down your painting to a board and work. You could take a sponge or a brush and just dampen your paper a little bit. That's all that I'm really trying to accomplish when I do that. So I'm going to go ahead and wet down the back of my paper. And I'm not getting it soaked. I'm taking a sponge and I'm just getting the whole area kind of evenly wet. All right, and now I'm going to do the same thing on the front of my painting. Just get it evenly wet. And once you do that, it helps the paper to lay flat. So what I want to paint first is the sky, and then I'm going to work down into the ground and add in some of those colors, and then we'll let that wash dry. So let's start with the sky first. Usually, in my first wash, I like to use a large brush. So here I have an Escoda size 18 mop brush, and basically just a large brush that can hold a lot of water. I typically work large shapes to small shapes, so I'm usually working large brushes to small brushes in my painting process as well. All right, what I want to mix up first is a cool gray for the sky. And I'll try to post the colors, all the colors that I'm using, in the description. Right there I use some lavender, a little bit of Payne's Gray, and I'm going to use some raw sienna. And that lavender and raw sienna kind of make a nice warm gray. And I'm going to paint that up here. And that is going to be the color of my cloud. I'm not going to obsess with making my sky look just like it does in my reference photo. Okay. We can have, we can paint this first wash pretty loose. So I'm bringing my water, my paint, down to about my horizon line, and I'm going to pause there for a minute. We're going to work on the sky a little bit more. So I want just a little stronger value, some Payne's Gray, some lavender, a little bit more raw sienna. And I'm adding some depth, some shape to these clouds. Okay, so what I've just laid in are the lighter areas of the sky, the lighter colors of the sky, the lightest tones of the sky. Okay, this is still damp. I'm going to move into the land below the sky now while this is still damp. I'm going to rinse off my brush, and I'm going to take more raw sienna and a little bit of lavender. Maybe a touch of some Payne's Gray or neutral tint. If you have that, you can use that as well. And what I'm thinking about here is where the land meets the sky. And also the color of my hay bales. Drop in a little more raw sienna on those areas. Get a nice warm color. And I want to start introducing some green. So what I like to use for my greens are cobalt turquoise and raw sienna. Those are a nice combo. So I'm taking cobalt turquoise and mixing in some raw sienna. Just adding some of that cobalt turquoise into my mixture and then adding some more raw sienna to come up with green. All right, and I can start to introduce some of that green right into this wet wash. And as we get closer to the foreground, I want stronger values, which means more of that color, less water, more paint, and I'm using a little more raw sienna and making the green a little warmer as we get to the foreground here. So I'm already starting to think about values in this first stage of the painting. Kind of reestablishing my horizon line because the paper is wet. Sometimes you'll have to go back and touch up some areas, add a little more strength if it wasn't right when you first put it down. Now I'm mixing in some burnt sienna, raw sienna, little warmer color. There's some kind of gaps in the grass in this field, some areas where you're seeing some dirt and some warmer colors. And I'm going to add that in now and let it mix nicely with these colors on the paper already. Looking for ways to create some more interest in the foreground here. And we'll come back to the foreground as the paper starts to dry. We just wanted to add a little bit more difference and interest in what's going on here. What happens when we paint with a lot of water is that when things dry, the colors fade a little bit. So you need to compensate that. You need to compensate for that. You need to paint maybe a little stronger than you might initially think. All right, I'm switching to a little smaller of a brush, and you can use any kind of round, smaller, smaller than my mop brush. So I started out here, and now I'm switching to something like this, and this holds a little bit less water, and I have a little more control because it's a smaller brush. And now I'm going to mix up some blue, some cobalt blue, some cerulean, a little bit of lavender mixed in with that. I just like the look that lavender gives it. But if you don't have all these colors, don't worry about it. We're just looking for less water, more paint, a little bit thicker consistency. And we're going to go back in and paint the blue areas of our sky. And this is a fun time in painting skies. We get to decide what parts of the skies are more important. I see a little lighter area here. I'm going to paint around that and try to define a cloud a little bit more. Something helpful when you're painting is hold a paper towel in your hand. If you have too much moisture on your brush, you can just touch that paper towel and take some of it off your brush. I always find it how interesting it is. When you think about skies, you think the majority of the sky is blue, but that's not the case. You can actually just paint a sky without even using that much blue. Little areas that are blue that kind of show where the sky is poking through between the clouds. Or the blue sky, you can kind of see through the clouds. I'm going to add some more cerulean to what I'm painting and a little more water. I'm going to do a touch of cobalt teal blue, just a little different of a blue as we move closer to the ground here. A little more cerulean. So we're just having fun, painting some clouds, trying to not overwork our sky. You don't really need to do a whole lot or say a whole lot with your sky. Just kind of indicate the type of day. Indicate the time of day. So I'm taking a little bit more of some of this gray that I already mixed up earlier. Maybe adding some cerulean to it. And I'm using the smaller synthetic brush because I want some smaller marks. Taking some of the water off on my brush if I need to. there's some shadows on the underside of some of these clouds that I'm painting with this smaller brush. And as you near the horizon line, you see more of these lines. They're closer together because you're seeing a larger group of the clouds, more of those horizontal lines of shadows as we move down. You could really kind of spend all day doing this, but you don't need to. Okay, and one last time, I'm gonna load up some blue on my brush. I like to do this when I'm wrapping up my sky. A little more cobalt blue, a little more cerulean, more paint. Make sure it gets mixed in. You don't want to just put straight pigment on your painting. And I'm once again defining a little area of the clouds. I like to give a little more interest, a little more strength to one area. All right, I think that's enough. The sky's reading pretty well. Maybe just a touch of blue up here to match some of that strength. But you don't need a lot for the sky. Okay, and before we are done with this first wash, I want to take a smaller brush, and I'm thinking about, are there any other bits of color that I need before this dries? Anything else I want a soft edge on? And in this case, I want to add a little more color to this hay bale. Just dropping that in while it's soft. And maybe a touch on this hay bale as well. Oh, I did mention working in the foreground a little bit more. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm still using my small brush, mixing in some thicker paint. I want a darker color for some of this grass that's a little closer to the viewer in the foreground here. We can add a little more interest. You could do a little bit of, if you like to splatter some color on, randomize some of those shapes, some of those marks. And who knows, once I get into this, I might even go over some of the foreground a little bit more. There's some texture in the grass, little bits of lines. Just some more interest. Okay, at this stage, we have our first wash done, our sky is painted, our lightest values are already painted in the scene. I'm going to let the painting dry, and when we come back, we're going to paint this large shape of trees in the background that's going to really define where the earth meets the sky, and we're going to connect that into some of these other trees. And once we get those mids and darks in, the sense of light is really going to show up. So let your paper dry, and then we'll come back in and we'll work on some of those things. Okay, we are back, and my paper is completely dry. And what we want to do next is paint these trees in the background. And we're using these trees to define our hay bale. So I'm going to mix up some green for this. And I have a little bit of it already on my palette. I'm going to take some cobalt turquoise, a little bit of raw umber, raw sienna, however you like to mix up your greens. Okay, so I have a good little mixture of that kind of dark green there. And you'll notice that the bottom of the shape of these trees is mainly flat. So here's a little tip for you. If you want that bottom to be flat, you can paint that part first and then paint the other areas. So I'm going to start over here at the left, and I'll work my way across the scene, and then I'm going to come back in and paint this darker tree that's a little bit closer to us. Okay, so I'm just starting over here. And I'm cutting around a couple shapes because there were some other hay bales in the distance there. And then I've come to the edge of this hay bale. I'm going to paint up around it like that. And I'm defining that hay bale with the shape of these trees. So that's called negative painting. We're painting a shape around a shape to define that shape. All right, so that's kind of the bottom of where those trees are. And then I'm going to go back in and fill this in. And I'm keeping this fairly simple. We're painting small. I'm not worrying a whole lot about the texture of these trees. Something I like to do when I'm painting is have a piece of scrap paper handy, and I can kind of, if I'm trying to get some dry brush, some more broken marks, I can use the side of my brush on some scrap paper, and that way I'm ensuring that I'm creating the mark that I want to make. So you can leave a few little gaps in these trees. And we are painting small, so something that's handy if you have some edges you want to break up, you can just use your finger. Kind of smudge that a little bit there. So I'm reloading my brush, I'm coming back. Now I know that I'm going to paint another tree over here. So I'll come back to that area. Right now I'm going to keep working my way across the painting here. All right, and I don't want to just outline the top of that hay bale. What I want to do is make sure that, the tops of these trees are as tall as I want them to be. And again, come back down to where you want the base of the trees to be, and you can paint that straight line just like that. Maybe there's another hay bale in the background that we're cutting around, some type of highlight. Okay, and before that line dries, go back and get some more paint on your brush. If I was painting a larger painting, I would probably use a little bit bigger of a brush. It's a little bit looser and get more texture, but I'm not too worried about that for today's painting. All right, and as we near the back of where these trees are, I'm adding in a little bit of this blue mixture. I'm just cooling down this green a little bit. Again, I'm highlighting the top of another hay bale. And then when we get to the end of this, just do that. And that's some trees off in the distance. All right, now before this dries, I'm gonna mix up some thicker paint, taking a little bit of my Payne's Gray, a little more cobalt blue, or cobalt turquoise with some cobalt blue, maybe some raw umber. And what I'm creating is a little darker shade to go back in and just find some areas that need a little more strength, some darks. We don't want those trees to look completely flat, so adding in another value that can it adds a little more interest to add some more value and some strength into some of these trees. And down near the bottom, there's more shadow. And now I am going to switch to a little bit bigger of a brush. This is a size 14 silver black velvet. It's a little bit looser, you can get more texture. And I'm going to load up a lot of paint on this brush. More of these greens. A lot of raw umber, raw sienna, cobalt turquoise. And now I'm going to paint a larger tree here that's going to kind of frame in our scene. And I'm kind of inventing this tree a little bit, loosely based on what's going on here in my reference photo. And this tree is just kind of frame in that side of our painting. It's creating something a little more interesting over on the side of the painting. And that's connecting right into what we've already painted there. And it can kind of break through some areas. Add a few more, maybe branches, leaves kind of here in this area. Okay, I'm going to leave that alone for now. Maybe soften the edge with my finger, the bottom of that tree a little bit. All right, let's move into the hay bale and some of these other areas. I have another tree over here. I can use what I've already mixed up. And I'm kind of using the side of my brush, trying to get a little more texture. Well, I guess I'll make it a little taller. I don't want to fill the whole thing in. Leave some gaps for the light to kind of shine through. And we'll get to the trunk of the tree here. Using that tree to bring some interest to this part of the painting. These areas of light, you can put some dark in there and make it a little more interesting. And this is a good practice in brushwork. Maybe there's some other trees that it connects with here. Okay, there's kind of a shadow side of this hay bale. I'm going to go ahead and connect that. I'm taking some raw sienna, a little bit of lavender, and some Payne's gray. So in my reference picture, it's just slightly overcast. There's some sun shining, but there isn't a lot of hard shadows. I'm going to add a little more light into the scene because I think that makes the scene a little more interesting. So in my scene, the sun is coming this way. So if I have shadows, I want them being cast towards the right. And I'm going to connect this hay bale to a shadow here. And that will be the shadow of this tree as well. Connecting a couple other shadows there. So I want this hay bale to look a little rounded. So I have my brush with just a little bit of clean water on it, and I'm going to press down, just take off a little bit of that. Let it look a little more rounded. All right, and now into this hay bale. Now I'm going to paint the front of that hay bale with some raw sienna, some lavender, and on into the shadow side. Of that. We have a slight connection with the trees in the background, which is always nice when you can find connections. Okay, more Payne's gray, lavender. maybe a touch of cobalt blue. And we'll go ahead and make a shadow that connects to this hay bale as well. Taking some of the paint off my brush, and I'll just take the edge and pull it out like that. So now we have a shadow on the side of the hay bale. It's nice to break up the edge of that shadow to kind of imply some grass, the texture of the grass there. Okay, so things are coming together. As we get the middle values and the darks incorporated into the scene, we're starting to see the light of the scene really show up. Okay, I have a couple other areas where I was suggesting some hay bales. I'm gonna add just a touch of this warmer color on those. All right, something else I want to do, I want to add a little more texture in this scene. And I'm going to take this brush that I've been using and get some cobalt turquoise, raw sienna, mix up another shade of green. Similar shade to what I've been using before. There's some different texture in the grass and the fields, and I'm going to use some of that. Kind of define a little bit more what's going on here. Use this texture to clarify some of this and connect some of it. So some of this that goes over to there. Connect that right into the hay bale. And let's see, just a few other bits of texture here. Maybe something right here. Some of this grass. Kind of connects into this tree over here. And in the foreground, one nice fast brush stroke. Use the texture of the paper. Maybe we add a little fence, a few fence posts that create some interest. So I'm just mixing up a stronger, warmer, some of my earth tones. So let's see, at this point, there's not a lot left to do. Add a little bit more texture on this hay bale that's closest to us. If things start looking a little too neat, a little too spelled out, I tend to just kind of smudge it with my thumb or my finger a little bit. I don't mind using my fingers in my painting. All right, maybe a touch more value here. Bring that light out a little more. Okay, something else you can do to add a little bit more detail. So right now, these trees are still wet in the distance. They're just slightly still damp. If I want to go in and scrape out a few little highlights, sometimes I like to use my palette knife. Now you can use your fingernail, something sharp, the side of a credit card, anything like that. I like this because I can get a little finer point to it. Do the same thing over here. Okay, the last thing that we're gonna do in this scene is something that's kind of fun. And we're gonna add a few birds in. So I'm gonna use a rigger brush, and I'm just grabbing some of what's left over on my palette. And let's add a few birds in. So one thing about painting birds is you don't want to paint them all exactly the same size, going the exact same direction. Another thing to be mindful of. I'm going to randomize your shapes as much as you can. Maybe there's a few birds over on this side. Adds a little bit of life, a little bit of interest to the scene. Well, I hope you enjoyed that landscape demonstration. The more we practice these things, the more natural they're going to come. And when we go to paint more complex scenes at larger sizes, doing these types of smaller practices can be very helpful in developing those skills. And before you go, I wanted to mention, if you haven't checked out my free video lesson, How to Avoid Overworking Your Painting, take a look at it. You can follow the link below. You can get to it in my bio and Instagram. So I've got some really good feedback from this lesson, and this is a video lesson that helps address something that I had to work through quite a bit when I was learning how to paint watercolor, and that is overworking my painting. I talk through 8 different tips to help you avoid overworking your painting. You can follow the link below, take a look at it, and I hope it can help you out as well. So thank you guys for spending some time with me here today. I hope that this video was helpful for you. Keep practicing, keep moving forward, and I'll see you next time.